Imagine a strategic partnership so tight that prime ministers chat through the night. A defense pact serving as the ultimate anchor in a turbulent region. Now, imagine that same bedrock shattering in less than a week. It was not a hostile adversary that pushed Rome to the breaking point, but a series of calculated actions against United Nations peacekeepers that crossed a line no sovereign nation can ignore. Welcome to the silent diplomatic earthquake reshaping the globe, where absolute military confidence meets the devastating reality of geopolitical isolation. Indeed, it is quite fascinating how a relationship once described as wearing the same pair of trousers can unravel in a single week. To understand the gravity of what just happened in Rome, we have to look past the dry diplomatic cables and into the quiet, almost intimate rapport between Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni and Benjamin Netanyahu. Their bond was not merely political, it was personal, often characterized by midnight phone calls and a shared right-wing ideological vision. Italy was not just a friend, it was Israel's most reliable. She did not just issue a critique, she reached for the very ballast of the bilateral relationship and pulled the plug. Suspension of the automatic renewal of the Italy and Israel Defense Agreement is a geopolitical earthquake. To the uninitiated, it might sound like a mere administrative delay, but in the world of high-stakes defense, this is a terminal signal. This pact, born in Paris in the year 2003 and solidified in 2016, serves as the legal and structural foundation for everything from intelligence sharing to high-tech weapons procurement. Under Article 9 of this agreement, renewal is automatic every 5 years, unless one side moves to stop. Meloni has now pressed that stop button. If a new consensus is not reached within 6 months, the entire framework of military cooperation between these two nations effectively vanishes. We are talking about an immediate guillotine drop on joint exercises, technical research, and the flow of critical military hardware. Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs attempted to downplay this, calling it a mere memorandum of understanding with no substance. But the data tells a far more brutal story between 2020 and 2024. Italy stood as Israel's third largest supplier of arms, trailing only the United States and Germany. While the volume might seem small compared to American giants, the specialization is irreplaceable. Consider Leonardo, the Italian defense titan. They provide the trainers and simulators that form the backbone of the Israeli Air Force's pilot education. More critically, Italian subsidiaries provide the sophisticated radar components for the Iron Fist active protection system, which shields Israeli tanks in the dense urban combat of Gaza. Even the F-35 program, the crown jewel of Israeli aerial supremacy, relies on components manufactured on Italian soil in 2024 alone. Despite a supposed freeze on new contracts, Italy exported over $5 million in military goods to Israel. When Rome halts this machinery, it is not just stopping a sale, it is amputating a limb of Israel's strategic depth in Europe. It is the shattering of a sanctuary. In the cold calculus of sovereignty, even the deepest friendship is eventually weighed against the cost of a partner's perceived recklessness. Trust, once broken, does not merely crack, it dissolves like salt in a rising tide. This pivot from political friction to outright rupture, rather tellingly, did not happen in a vacuum. It was forged in the crucible of southern Lebanon over 96 hours of escalating hubris between April 7th and April 12th. A series of calculated provocations targeted the United Nations interim force in Lebanon. This is a vital peacekeeping mission mandated by international law, costing the global community roughly $500 million annually to maintain. Italy commands a massive presence in this theater, historically deploying over 1,000 highly trained troops to stabilize the volatile frontier. To understand the gravity of this escalation, one must realize that intimidating a United Nations peacekeeper is a severe violation of international norms, but deliberately targeting a sovereign nation's own soldiers deployed overseas, that ceases to be a distant political debate. It instantly becomes a direct, visceral threat to national security. It began on April 7th, when Israeli forces detained a Spanish peacekeeper for an hour. This was a diplomatic warning shot, a blatant test of European resolve. The very next day, a logistics convoy clearly marked with the distinct United Nations blue, manned entirely by Italian personnel, was fired upon. Bullets tore through the tires and armored bumpers, forcing a frantic, dangerous retreat to the base. By April 11th, military units had advanced directly to the peacekeeping headquarters, systematically using black paint to blind the security cameras and deface the facility gates. But the ultimate crossing of the Rubicon occurred on April 12th. Israeli 65-ton Merkava main battle tanks deliberately rammed Italian peacekeeping vehicles not once, but twice. This was no tragic accident lost in the fog of war. This was a systematic, orchestrated humiliation. Italy's defense minister demanded an immediate international investigation, stating that such actions were absolutely unacceptable. Simultaneously, the foreign minister summoned the Israeli ambassador to Rome, delivering a message stripped of all diplomatic niceties. Italian soldiers stationed in Lebanon are untouchable. When a military operates with the baseline assumption that its immediate tactical objectives supersede the physical safety of its allies' soldiers, it fundamentally misreads the geopolitical landscape. The deployment of the Italian Sassari Brigade to Lebanon was originally designed to maintain regional stability, functionally buffering the border and easing the pressure on Israel's northern flank. Yet, the operational command chose to turn its heavy armor against the very international mechanism engineered to prevent a wider conflagration. Historically, armed forces that mistake tactical impunity for strategic brilliance often find themselves winning mere skirmishes while losing their entire sphere of influence. A modern military can possess the most advanced thermal optics and interceptor missiles in the world, but there is no radar technology capable of detecting the sudden collapse of political goodwill. The kinetic actions in Lebanon acted as a corrosive acid, quietly but permanently eating through the load-bearing pillars of decades of defense architecture. When a state begins to treat its most steadfast international shields as expendable obstacles on the battlefield, it does not project invincibility. It broadcasts a profound, isolating arrogance. Furthermore, if we peel back the layers of this diplomatic rupture, we uncover a truth far more grounded in domestic survival than mere ideological alignment. Why would Giorgia Meloni, a leader who previously absorbed intense criticism from her own political base to maintain harmony with Washington, suddenly choose to alienate both Israel and a highly vocal Donald Trump? The answer lies in the unforgiving mathematics of domestic economics. Geopolitical loyalty is ultimately a luxury commodity. When the internal supply chain begins to suffocate, a state can no longer afford the geopolitical premium. Italy is a nation that imports approximately 75% of its total energy requirements, relying heavily on the unhindered flow of global maritime trade to keep its industries breathing. The destabilization radiating from the Middle East is not merely a distant television spectacle for Rome. It is an immediate punishing inflation, tax levied on every citizen. In her pivotal April 14th address, Meloni specifically pointed to the strategic vulnerability of the Strait of Hormuz. This critical maritime artery does not merely dictate global hydrocarbon security. It fundamentally controls the transport of essential fertilizers required to sustain Italian agriculture, and allies reckless military adventurism, which perpetually inflames regional volatility, translates directly into skyrocketing utility bills, fractured logistics, and disrupted food supplies across the European continent. Moreover, the domestic political cost of solidarity has become astronomically high. We are witnessing a profound internal backlash, epitomized by Italian dockworkers actively threatening widespread industrial strikes. The catalyst for this labor unrest was the interception of the global Samud fleet, a civilian initiative attempting to deliver humanitarian aid to Gaza. Previously, the Italian government had gone so far as to deploy its own naval vessels to escort international maritime convoys. However, after Israeli forces intercepted these vessels in international waters, detaining nearly 500 international activists, with 6 crew members still remaining in military custody, the Italian Navy was forced into a humiliating withdrawal of its ships. This staggering incident sparked monumental controversy within Italy, rapidly eroding the remaining reservoirs of public sympathy. How long can any elected leadership ignore the deafening roar of its own industrial base, when the tangible cost of supporting a foreign partner wildly surpasses the strategic benefits? A pivot becomes the only viable mechanism for political survival. A sovereign economy is much like a complex biological organism. It will instinctively restrict blood flow to a wounded, necrotic extremity in order to preserve the beating heart of its core organs. In the ruthless ledger of statecraft, absolute military superiority means nothing if your actions actively bankrupt the logistical arteries of your friends. Ideological alliances may be written in ink, but economic survival is always carved in stone. The fracture with Rome, however, is merely the opening sequence of a much larger institutional collapse. To truly comprehend the geopolitical peril Israel now faces on the continent, we must pivot from the Mediterranean coast to the plains of Central Europe, where the ultimate diplomatic firewall has just been reduced to ashes. For over a decade and a half, the government in Budapest, under the administration of Viktor Orban, functioned as an impenetrable shield for Israel within the architecture of the European Union. To grasp the magnitude of this loss, one must understand the mechanical voting structure of the European Council. When the European Union attempts to draft foreign policy resolutions, impose economic sanctions, or issue collective condemnations, the mechanism requires absolute unanimity among all 27 member states. It is a system intentionally designed to be cumbersome, and it possesses a glaring vulnerability. A single dissenting voice can paralyze the entire bloc for 16 years. Orban gladly provided that paralyzing voice. He consistently deployed his absolute veto power to neutralize any consensus forming against Israel, serving as the emergency contact on Jerusalem's diplomatic speed dial. This was not merely a political friendship. It was an ironclad strategic insurance policy guaranteeing that the European continent could never collectively penalize Israeli actions. But on April 12th, a seismic electoral earthquake incinerated that insurance policy overnight. Driven by a staggering voter turnout of 79.5%, a historic high that signaled a profound exhaustion with the status quo, the Hungarian electorate dismantled entrenched political orthodoxy. The opposition Tisza party, spearheaded by Peter Magyar, seized an overwhelming 138 out of 199 parliamentary seats. This absolute two-thirds supermajority effectively erased the previous regime's monopoly on power. The consequences for the Middle East are immediate and catastrophic. Magyar has explicitly declared that Budapest will recalibrate its compass to align with mainstream European mandates, including a formal return to the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. The era of the automatic veto is officially dead. Moving forward, every single European Union resolution concerning Middle Eastern conflicts will be subjected to a rigorous case-by-case evaluation. As a former Israeli ambassador to Hungary astutely observed, the closer a government orbits to the political center of Brussels, the less atmospheric oxygen exists to advocate for Israeli exceptionalism. A diplomatic fortress that appears utterly impenetrable from the outside will swiftly and violently collapse if its internal keystone is quietly removed. By losing its ultimate proxy in Budapest, Israel has not just lost a friendly voice, it has lost its structural immunity within the world's largest trading bloc, leaving it completely exposed to the gathering storm of European consensus. Consequently, the collapse of the Italian Defense Pact and the incineration of the Hungarian political firewall are not isolated anomalies. They are merely the most visible fractures in a rapid, continent-wide structural alienation. If we shift our gaze across the European landscape, the sheer scale of this diplomatic hemorrhage becomes undeniable. Look at Madrid. Following Spain's formal recognition of the Palestinian state in May 2024, diplomatic channels began to actively freeze. By March 2026, the Spanish government systematically downgraded its diplomatic relations with Israel to the absolute baseline level of a charged affairs. The rhetoric matched the policy, with Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez explicitly accusing the Israeli leadership of a systematic violation of international law. But perhaps the most startling indicator of this structural isolation comes from Berlin. Germany has historically anchored its foreign policy in a profound, guilt-driven commitment to Israeli security. Yet, even this most patient of allies was pushed into outrage. The breaking point materialized when Israel's finance minister, speaking on Holocaust Remembrance Day, shockingly invoked the term ghetto to describe the resistance to Jewish settlements. This was a grotesque weaponization of Europe's deepest historical trauma. It was an offense so severe that it prompted Israel's own former ambassador to Germany, a seasoned diplomat, to publicly break ranks and condemn the minister's remarks. When the architects of a state's foreign policy begin fighting themselves in the public square, it is a glaring symptom of terminal strategic rot. This cascading frustration culminated in March 2026, when the foreign ministers of 10 major European powers, including the United Kingdom and France, united with senior European Union officials to issue an unprecedented joint declaration. They vehemently condemned the military aggression against the United Nations forces in Lebanon's 10 sovereign nations. Closing ranks to publicly reprimand a partner. This is no longer private diplomatic friction. It is a public excommunication. Why is this incredibly dangerous? We must look at the hard economic realities in 2024. European markets consumed over 30% of Israel's total international trade. The continent is not just a political ally, it is the vital technological and financial circulatory system that sustains the Israeli economy. To assume that Washington can indefinitely backfill this massive European void is a fatal miscalculation. The United States is currently navigating its own treacherous waters of sluggish economic recovery, and a deeply polarized electorate that is fiercely exhausted by endless foreign financial commitments. History offers a brutal warning to states that mistake battlefield dominance for grand strategy, much like the ancient military apparatus of Sparta, which won countless tactical engagements, but ultimately collapsed because it alienated every potential ally. Modern nations cannot survive on kinetic force alone. A state cannot treat its international partners like disposable lithium batteries, draining their political capital for short-term tactical gains, and discarding them when the diplomatic optics become inconvenient. When a nation weaponizes its absolute military confidence to systematically burn every diplomatic bridge on the continent, the resulting isolation is never a temporary weather anomaly. It is a permanent, devastating climate change from which no amount of interceptor missiles or armored battalions can ever provide shelter. So I leave you with this thought to ponder. We are witnessing a profound reflection on the illusion of invincibility. When tactical aggression blinds a state to strategic alliances, the isolation that follows is neither accidental nor temporary. It is deeply structural. Can hard power ever truly replace the diplomatic trust required to sustain a nation in the 21st century? If your own country's soldiers, wearing the blue helmets of peace, were fired upon by a close ally, how would you expect your government to respond? I would love to hear your perspectives, so please share your thoughts down in the comments below. Until next time, keep observing the shifting world